I usually wander. Should I wander? Yeah, what?
I think the rain is going to come now.
Are they gonna stay?
I think 118 at my last count. They love the wanderers.
Wanderers.
They love that.
I try not to sniff. Yeah.
Well, we're very expensive to our
This gray one.
I think you can stop. Got ready? Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Zoomers, please remember to stay muted, but questions and answers, I'll open it up and I'll watch for questions to come from you. People in the room, if you have a cell phone, please silence it so it doesn't interrupt our speaker. I appreciate that. And Sheila Dickison is going to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Pam. I am very pleased to introduce Lynn Leverty, our presenter today. I have always admired the fact that Lynn has been both a practitioner in her discipline and a researcher and teacher. After earning her Ph.D. in 1983 in political science from American University, she worked in Congress as well as for the legendary governor of Texas, Ann Richards, before she came to Gainesville in 1994 as a lecturer in political science. At UF, she taught women in politics, the politics of immigration, and both grad and undergraduate courses in public leadership and ethics. Later, she became a staff member in the Bob Graham Center, where we were colleagues for a fair number of years. You will be amused to know that when I asked the artificial intelligence app ChatGPT for a summary of Lynn's career, it noted that students indicated that her courses were instrumental in preparing them for applied policy work, particularly in roles such as staffer in the U.S. House of Representatives. So I think I'm in very good company in recognizing her twin roles of practitioner and teacher. Lynn is widely known as an engaging presenter, both as a faculty member and in retirement, where she continues to do presentations on political topics of interest. And so here's Lynn to elaborate on her intriguing title, Politics in Bathrooms.
You'll have to excuse me today. I have a small cold, so I may sniff occasionally. And if you can't understand me, let me know, because I may be a little bit raspy. Today, we're going to take a look at the history and policies and laws that involve restrooms. That doesn't seem, and it's a topic I've actually been interested in since I was a child. Well, my father was a political reporter, so I ended up talking about politics. That's all anybody talked about at home, so I would be interested in it even if I hadn't wanted to be interested in it. But my grandmother lived in a very small East Texas town. And every summer I had to go to see her and get my picture taken. I don't know why I got my picture taken there and not at home, but whatever. And of course, it was a very, very conservative town. And when they go shopping, there would be white-only restrooms, and which confused me no end, and nobody would explain it to me until one of the more progressive people in town built a colored restroom. Now, I thought that meant there were going to be colors. You know, we were going to have a pink toilet or, you know, striped wallpaper or something that was going to be a lot of fun. So I used it, much to the absolute upset of everybody around, because you weren't obviously supposed to do that. And my mother finally had to sit me down and explain to me about what the issues were and what the problems were and what was happening. And at that point, I got very interested in the fact that that restrooms were political, that restrooms were used so some people could go out in the public sector and do things, and some people could not access the public sector as well. And when we happened to move to Washington, D.C. when I was in middle school, of course, that was the center of civil rights movement at that point. It got even more interesting. So this has been a topic I've actually been interested in since I was 7. So not necessarily one of those things most children think about, but it was interesting to me. Now, the U.S. ranks 56th in the world, and please don't ask me about the methodology of this, I don't know it, but ranks 56th in the world in the provision of public restrooms. We don't do well with public restrooms at all. We're worse than Iceland. And we're not very often compared to Iceland. I guess the new thing should be we be compared to Greenland, but I don't know about the restrooms there. So what we do in this country is we expect the private sector to step up. So if you were going to go shopping in the rain this afternoon, you would probably end up in a store restroom or at a gas station or something like that, because you wouldn't want to go downtown to the courthouse and go through security and all those sorts of things to use the bathroom. And you necessarily, because it's raining, you wouldn't want to go to a public park. So to a great extent, when I say restrooms in this presentation, I'm talking about both the mall restroom and the gas station restroom and ones that are actually built by the government, because we don't do that much. In fact, there's an interesting thing going on in New York City right now, which is the New York Times wrote an article about a month ago saying that, let's see if I can get, there we go, saying that the restrooms in New York City were inferior. We have about one public restroom for every 8,000 people in the United States. New York has one for every 10,000. So the New York Times wrote an article and said, this is ridiculous. We need more restrooms and we need cleaner restrooms. Now, restrooms are expensive because it takes, you not only have to build them, you have to maintain them, and you have to go in there after a bunch of teenage boys have thrown all the toilet, the toilet paper around and the paper towels around, and you have to keep cleaning them. So they are an expensive public expenditure. Well, yesterday, by the way, yeah, good, I got that right. I cleaned it up. Yesterday, this was written as a letter to the editor to the New York Times saying, we are investing $150 million in public restrooms, and we're going to build 46 new ones and refurbish some of the old ones. So there's a big thing going on in New York City right now about we need more public restrooms. And part of that is it's a large tourism center. And part of it is they have a large homeless population, and the homeless population uses public restrooms. So this is, I love the last of it where he said we have more public park restrooms than Starbucks. So we're now comparing ourselves to Starbucks. Starbucks, by the way, for a while, let anybody come in and use the restroom. They stopped that policy because, again, it'd be too expensive in restroom maintenance. But so we're now comparing ourselves to Starbucks in New York. A bit of history. Until the 1850s, there wasn't anything like restrooms, but two things happened in the 1850s. One was the first toilet was patented in the United States. And by the way, it looks like the most uncomfortable thing you've ever seen in your life. I know, so how in the world people actually used it? It was obviously constructed by someone, civil engineer or a plumber, and not someone who wanted anything that looked comfortable. The other thing that happened in the 1850s was that Edward Snow in London scientifically proved that typhoid germs were in the water in a particular pump in London, and there was a typhoid epidemic. Those two things together made people start getting more interested in waste and what you do with waste, because if it does chart epidemics and so forth and so on, and people don't have anywhere to put that, then you've got a problem. So the United States started looking at sewer systems and trying to develop sewer systems in the 1850s. There were a couple of cities that actually put very rudimentary sewer systems in Chicago, and I think Brooklyn, I know Chicago, because they had epidemics. But so waste management became a public health issue, and that made it more important. So as the technology developed, people began to get more interested in, well, okay, we have the technology, we have a sewer system, let's have a restroom, we can connect these and so forth and so on. In the United States, but who should pay for this? In the United States, we decided that public sewer systems were a public expenditure. They were part of infrastructure. There are other countries that have not done that, but for us, they are. And there's a fascinating political story in the development of this infrastructure, because it has sort of, do you put it in rich areas? Do you put it in poor areas? Where do you put the sewer systems? There are areas of Gainesville that are still on the septic system because people built houses there before the sewer system reached their neighborhood. And it turns out, from a friend of mine who told me this the other day, it is extremely expensive to move from a septic system to connecting to the city's sewer system. Wastewater treatment plants didn't actually start being developed until 1890. And actually, I have a silly fact there that it happened to be in Worcester, Massachusetts, in case anybody cares about that. But so what you had with these sewer systems was sewer going into cesspits until you actually had a wastewater treatment plant. So it wasn't really great to do. But again, one of the things that became important was who was going to have access to the things that were being developed. And the first people who did not have access, interestingly enough, were women. Women were not nice women, you know, middle class and upper class women in the 1800s and the early part of the 20th century were not supposed to be in public. You stayed home, you went to your friend's house, and you went to church. And that was it. So women were excluded when they started putting bathrooms in buildings, like if you were a lawyer's office and you wanted a bathroom, you put in a sink and a urinal. Well, unless the woman is incredibly acrobatic, urinals do not work for women. So women were to a great extent excluded from having restrooms. Obviously, this became a policy issue for the suffragettes and the prohibitionists and women who were, I forgot to do this. This was a tradition, this and this were the traditional uses. I forgot to say that. I happen to love this one. I don't understand why this man wants his face in the bottom of a chamber pot. Maybe somebody didn't like him. And so they decided that they would put his face on the bottom of the chamber pot. I have no idea, but that's one of my favorite pictures of it because it's just who wants your name, who wants your face in the bottom of a chamber pot? The other, oh no, okay. I'll leave that one for a minute. So as women began to advocate for having a restroom available, you know, if they went to the lawyer or they went somewhere, they wanted to go shopping, began to advocate for this. Stores began to realize they could get more customers if they had a women's restroom and other kinds of things to get to more customers. And so eventually, that is a New York restroom that included women, built in right around 1900. This is actually a restroom at a girls' school. Normally, restrooms don't have showers, obviously. You're not going to put a shower in a public restroom, although there's some buildings at UF who still have them, interestingly enough. Now, there was a problem here. Do you see how narrow those stalls are? If you're wearing this, you can't make your way into this. Nope, whoop, went the wrong way. No, going the wrong way. I'm going the wrong way. No, I'm still going the wrong way. What is going on here? Okay, I need help. This is where my cold medicine doesn't help. I need to go back to 5 or 6, 7. Yeah, I can get it past 6. Okay, so in other words, women started saying we need nicer looking restrooms because I don't know about you, but if I tried to get into a restaurant stall in that outfit, my hat would be on the floor or my petticoats would be wet or whatever else, but it would not be good. So this kind of thing started being developed in fancy stores and this is actually a restaurant restroom in New York City. So a lot of attention was put on women's restrooms. Men's did not look like this. I don't know who picked out the wallpaper. It's really terrible, but, and things like this happen where the advertisement for a restaurant includes ladies' restaurants and lounging rooms. Now, lounging rooms I don't get, but did any of you work at UF and ever go into Old Norman Hall? There was a restroom in Old Norman that had a sofa that you could go rest in. I guess it was for the teachers because Old Norman was part of the school. I guess it was for the teachers if they completely lost it during the day. They could go they could do lounges, but women had lounges and they had this kind of thing. So by the 1930s, this was women's restrooms, the moment women were no longer not being able to use the restroom. Now, this is not the last thing, however, that happened about women's restrooms. When the ERA came up, one of the arguments against the ERA was that women would no longer be able to have their separate restrooms. That was totally not true, but it was a very effective argument. opponents to ERA would say, well, your little girl's going to go to the bathroom and then some big man's going to walk in and what are you going to do? You can't protect your daughters with the ERA being enacted. So, you're going to have restrooms and prisons and everything. We're all not going to be sex segregated. That was not true, but it was very, very, very effective and a strong part of the fact that the ERA is not law. We don't have the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, the other thing that's just interesting, and I'll bring it up and I will come back to it as well, is inequity in restrooms. Men, because they can have urinals, have more facilities in their restrooms than women do. There are a couple of states that have actually passed potty parity bills, which is a little too cute, but there you are, that there should be equal numbers of places for men and women. That would be nice because I think many of us who are women have spent a lot of time in lines at various places doing that. The one place where there was absolutely no potty parity was in the US Capitol. The men, when the Capitol was built, there were no elected women. So they put lovely cloakrooms next to the floor for men. And they could go in and they could use the facilities. They could get their shoes shined. They could get some tea or whatever. And that was very nice. And they could talk to each other off the floor of the Senate and House, which meant they could make bargains and do things like that and all sorts of things. Well, when women started getting elected, there were no restrooms for them. Guess when they finally were built? Yeah. For women in the Senate, who obviously had a little more clout than women in the House, it was 1993. And it wasn't a cloakroom. We're not talking shoe shine. We're talking 3 toilets and 2 sinks. But at least it was better than having to go down and use the public restrooms, which ended up with, of course, the lobbyists would sit outside the restroom and wait to snag a senator or whatever, or to go all the way back to your office, which could take 20 minutes each way. And then you missed floor debate, which is very important at the time, that you don't want to be, if they're debating something that's very important to your district, you don't want to be wandering around, the streets to get to your office to actually use the bathroom to come back. So female members of the Senate got theirs in 1993. It took until 2011 for women in the House to have access to a restroom that was private and didn't have to wander through the Capitol and all those kinds of things. Obviously, that has come up again recently, and I'll get to that in a minute. But again, it's not a fancy restroom. One of the workarounds that women had in the House was often, once women moved into senior positions, they could have an office in the Capitol, and that office would be open to female members of the House. In fact, Nancy Pelosi stocked hers with all kinds of stuff so that House members could use that rather than wandering around. So we didn't have a whole lot of parity. Now, the second group to be excluded, obviously, were racial and ethnic minorities. And this was absolutely, totally to keep them from being active in the public sector and to make them feel as if they were second-class citizens. We didn't have restrictions until after the Civil War because there was a thought that nobody was ever going to think to do that. No one was going to be brave enough to do that. After the Civil War, of course, several African-American congressmen were elected. Other people began to want to be more, thought they had an opportunity to be more in the public sector until, at least in the South, Jim Crow laws were enacted, which basically said that public accommodations were not open to anyone who was Black or African American. Now, we tend to know. So we have, and actually that one's fancy because there was actually a colored restroom option. Normally it was not. This is actually a restroom, Jumpers Good Golf Station, who is actually advertising that it is segregated, and the ladies had mirrors in case that was important. you'll have a little sexism in this. Of course, I'm sure there's no mirrors in the men's room. That here we are, you can use our gas station because we are ensured that it is segregated, and you will not be at all bothered by anybody else. I have always loved that one just because it's so ridiculous that you put mirrors in it as well as other things. So obviously, this was a big deal with Jim Crow. But what a lot of people don't know is that Hispanic people in the Southwest were equally segregated and equally not able to use public restrooms. Same kind of laws were passed, same kind of policies existed, so that if you were Latino or Hispanic or Spanish and Mexican, you were not allowed to use restrooms either. And in the West Coast, and I don't have a sign for that. If you were Asian, you were not allowed to use any kind of public restroom. And in fact, they called you Mongols. And people were for instance, in San Francisco, if you were of Chinese ancestry, you were actually required to live in Chinatown and to only use the facilities and services in Chinatown. You were not actually allowed to wander around either Los Angeles or San Francisco. So these laws took place all over the country in order to keep anyone who was a ethnic and also Indians. I forgot about that, but if you were in New Mexico or Colorado or Arizona, if you were Native American, you were also not able to access public restrooms and public buildings, but we're only talking about restrooms today. So restrooms became a key issue in the civil rights movement. In fact, one of the first people who was killed in the civil rights movement was a young Black college student who tried to use a gas station restroom. And he was shot by the owner of the gas station. Needless to say, the gas station owner did not have any penalty for shooting the young civil rights worker. I think they had a minor trial, everybody acquitted him, and there was no problem. But it not only affected just daily life, but one of the things that happened during the civil rights movement, if you do not have access to restrooms, you have to severely restrict the amount that you eat and you drink. So when you were participating in civil rights demonstrations and civil rights marches, many of those people were dehydrated. And it had long-term health effects for some people because they had to, in order to be active, since you didn't have access to a restroom, you had to not drink and not eat as much, and it did have a health impact on some people. And if you think about it, if you're marching from Selma to Montgomery, which was 54 miles, and you're not able to drink or eat much before that, it's a pretty restricted, pretty hard on the system to do that. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned racial and ethnic bathroom discrimination, although enforcing that is difficult. Unless you have a bathroom monitor and someone's standing there to say you can or can't use this, it's very, very difficult to monitor what the policy is. Today, I don't think there's a great deal of problem, but for years after the Civil Rights Act, there was still discrimination. It was still very difficult for people to use restrooms either in stores or public buildings or whatever. It was a little easier in public buildings because it was a public law. And you could see that. Now, last year, the Women's Rights March figured out a way around the problem of dehydration. And this happened to be something on my social media feed, which was pitch in to put porta potties along the march route so that people could use the bathroom. They're doing it again this year for the Women's Rights March. It's a very clever idea to actually have people pitch in and bear the cost of having porta potties, not the most fun thing in the world to use, but good to use, along the parade route so that women could drop out, use them, and come back in, which is I think a good idea, kind of a creative idea to do. So that is now beginning to be a thing. And I did have one interesting experience when I was in the governor's office. Congress passed this bizarre legislation that was supposed to fund small communities and public projects in small communities. And it was like a Christmas tree bill. It was all sorts of weird things in it. But one of them was to try to help economic development in small towns. And a woman called me from Turkey, Texas. I had to look it up on the map. I had no idea where Turkey, Texas was. It's right below the Panhandle in case anybody cares. And she said she wanted to know if she could get funding for a porta potty. And I said, why? And it turned out they had built a playing field in their town and they needed a public bathroom next to the playing field. This was an economic development project because teams would come in from the small towns around there and they buy lunch or they do whatever and so forth. And this was actually an economic development project. They had planted bushes for the boys. And they had contracted with a woman whose house was next to the field for the girls to come use her bathroom. Well, the lady next to the field was getting tired of the girls' teams coming in to use their bathroom for obvious reasons. They were providing her with paper towels and toilet paper, but you can imagine muddy, I don't know, my kids played soccer. By the time that their cleats and their shin guards and all this were dirty and muddy and going in to use the bathroom and so forth. The lady was getting really tired of this, but there was a lot of social pressure on her not to stop because they wanted people to come use this playing field. And so her solution was a porta potty for the girls. And I said, well, maybe we could get you some money if you were actually going to build a restroom. And she said, no, the city fathers didn't want to do that. They weren't interested in that. So her solution was the porta potty. And I said, I'm sorry, this has to be for infrastructure. And porta potties aren't an infrastructure. So I don't know whatever happened in Turkey, Texas to their field, whether that poor woman is still having to have the girls traipse through her. But it was one of the things that, again, reminded me of how important restrooms can be. Because for her, I'm sure that poor woman was about ready to go nuts. With having people tromp through her house all the time. But for that town, it was really important. Well, the next issue that came up was persons with disabilities. There was never any discrimination against persons with disabilities. Nobody thought about them. No, wasn't a big deal. So they weren't legally discriminated against, but access was very, very difficult because especially if you're on a wheelchair or you have a walker or things like that, it is really almost impossible to use a restroom. I found that out with my mom. My mother had terminal cancer and she was in a wheelchair, and we went into a place where there was no wheelchair accessible toilet, and I figured out how difficult it was for her to be able to do that. And so persons with disabilities were advocating for this, but the pushback was, this is really expensive. We have to go in and retrofit our restrooms. We have to we have to have more space, because not only do you need the restroom itself, but you need space to maneuver a wheelchair into that space, which means you don't have a lot of right angles and things like that. So business and the public sector pushed back and said, well, this isn't that important. Finally, let me see, I'm sorry. Until 1968, OSHA actually pushed to get a law passed that said that every federal building had to have restrooms that were accessible to people with disabilities. Now that's nice, but I'm sure the lady in Turkey, Texas did not have a federal building. I'm sure lots of places didn't have a federal building. But at least started the advocacy for having retrofitting buildings or creating restrooms that had access to for persons with disabilities. The Americans with Disabilities Act was finally passed in 1990 that made had make restrooms accessible. Now, they obviously allowed a phase-in time because places had to go back and rebuild and refit, and that took a very long time. You can still find in some public buildings restrooms that are not necessarily really fit for trying to move a wheelchair around in, but it certainly was important. See where I'm on. All right, now we get to the issue that is really fiery today, which is gender. Now, I want to say that this is an issue that really only affects about 0.25% of the population. So for the amount of time and effort that we have spent politically on this, for a very small, now I don't say that it's not important, it's just that it has actually become a proxy for a lot of other issues. And that is gender identity and who should use which bathroom. And if you are, for instance, this one, of course, is that even if you're a trans woman, you should use the men's room. And this is one of the things that has been put up in billboards and all kinds of things right now. Right now, all the red ones are states that have prohibitions that say that you have to use the bathroom of the sex that you were born, whatever was written on your birth certificate. And there's some interesting things about that. I have a friend who's a geneticist, and he was talking about the fact that there are people who are intersex and have characteristics of both sexes when they're born. So I have no idea what happens to those people. Because these laws say that it should be whatever the birth certificate says goes. So the red states have passed laws saying that you have to use the restroom of the birth, what's on your birth certificate. The yellow states are where it is proposed or pending, and the blue states are ones that are whatever. We're not gonna pass laws on it yet. Obviously, you see the usual kind of transition of the northeastern states are more liberal about these. Southern states, much less liberal. Currently Florida requires that you use the bathroom of what is on your birth certificate. Now, the problem here, and one of the ways that we evaluate laws is whether or not they're enforceable. If you've got a law that nobody can enforce, okay, it's a policy, but it really isn't very effective. And these laws are really not enforceable unless you're going to have someone stand in front of every bathroom and ask for a birth certificate. And most of us don't carry our birth certificates. And so these are laws that, as a political scientist, I would tell you are really, they have taken a lot of public interest. There's been a lot of public activity. There's been a lot of things, going on back and forth and lots of time. UF passed a law that said you have to use, the bathroom on your birth certificate, which Sheila and I know didn't happen on the second floor at the Graham Center. We had 2 one-stall bathrooms in the second floor of Pugh Hall, and we had more women than men. So if it got too crowded and things got too difficult, the women used the men's room, and you know what? Nothing happened. Except the men occasionally went, well, we usually always got in on time, and now we have to wait for you guys. But so this is the issue now, and there's been an enormous amount of public outcry, an enormous amount of issues on this, and yet it is totally unenforceable. Now, I told you I would get back to congressional bathrooms. When Sarah McBride, who is a transgender woman from Delaware, got elected to Congress, before she had even set foot in DC, one of the women in Nancy Mace, who's representative, said that she would stand in front of the House members' women's room, and for her life to bar Sarah McBride from using the House women's restroom. And this got a lot of outcry. In the middle of the whole speaker's debate, Mike Johnson had to stop and say that he had passed a rule that of the same rule of only use the bathroom on your birth certificate in the middle of the speakers debate, which was interesting. And so what Nancy Mace did not know was Sarah McBride had already decided she was not going to make this a public issue. That she had talked to the speaker and she had talked to the Democratic whip, both of whom had offices in the Capitol, and she was going to use their restroom if she needed to come off the floor and to use a restroom. So she had no intention of making this an issue because she wanted to focus on issues that were important to Delaware. And she didn't want to be the spokesperson for, gender rights at that point. She wanted to focus on the dishwasher. So she had already taken care of this. She had no intention of using the women's restroom. And what is also interesting is federal regulations from OSHA, the EEOC, and anybody who is contracting with the federal government has to allow people to use a restroom of their choice. So if the federal government wanted to, they could make this a real a national issue because of the OSHA regulations and EEOC regulations. OSHA oversees workplace safety and workplace conditions. EEOC is Equal Opportunity Commission. So they could actually make this a much bigger issue if they wanted to. They have chosen at this point not to do that because there are more people affected by other issues that they are dealing with in terms of workplace safety and equal opportunity, and this is a very small group. So why all this fuss about restrooms? We all need them. I'm always very grateful, when I'm traveling somewhere to find a gas station. I wish they kept their restrooms cleaner, but at least they're there. Because I would, if you count on a public rest stop, you're going to be waiting a long time in a lot of places. So I'm very, part of it is because the United States has moved to a public-private motive rule in terms of providing restrooms. And so many of the restrooms are private. And we have always had a feeling in this country that the government shouldn't mess too much with private entities. Not that we don't, but we're very centered on private organizations having the right to do what they want to do. So part of this is that. Part of it is simply that it's not been important to anyone except who are being excluded. If you can use a restroom, you oftentimes don't worry about somebody else not being able to. So the people who have been excluded have to protest, they have to make noise, they have to do something while the rest of us other people don't have to worry about it. And the other thing is this is symbolic. Being unable to use a restroom, being unable to be out in public lets you know that you're a second-class citizen. And so we have used it for 150 whatever years as a way to tell people who counts and who doesn't. And so far, since the time that restrooms have been developed in this country, we have always had somebody who couldn't use them. So this will continue to be a public policy issue. It will continue to be a public issue, at least for the foreseeable future. I don't know that we will ever completely ignore it. So that's my thing. Any questions? Yeah.
That was fascinating. You never disappoint. Really enjoyed.
I'm reminded of that wonderful scene in Hidden Figures, the movie, where the Black woman who is this wonderful statistician has to go a half mile to use a bathroom for a colored woman, and it's just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And the powers that be, just don't understand it until she says, this is an impossible situation for me. I can't work like this.
Yeah, which is exactly the issue of if you don't have access, you have to be responsible for making noise because other people don't really ever think about it.
Clearly, there's a variety of approaches to women's rights and equality across countries.
Mhm.
So is this being played out internationally as well? The Nordic countries, there seem to be a very equal thing, and in some of the other parts of the world, not so much. Is this kind of represented globally?
Well, interestingly enough, in Europe, there is a great model for public restrooms. We were in Germany at one point, and they actually had outdoor urinals for men. And my sons just went, this is terrible, because you could see men's feet, or whatever. I got chased out of a public restroom in France once because I didn't have money to tip the lady who was cleaning it, because I'd left my purse with my husband. And literally, she chased me out of it, yelling at me. I don't know what she said because my high school French wasn't good enough to know. So in Europe, there is a model for having public restrooms. They've even got modular units on sidewalks and things. You get into poor countries, yes, very definitely. So not only do they not build very many restrooms, but there are different sanctions against them. So yeah, I mean, it really depends on whether you have a public infrastructure kind of thing where you expect the public to do more, or you don't expect the public to do more. When you get into countries where most everything is private restrooms, you can get discrimination much more.
I just wanted, well, before I make my comment, I want to tell you, I was one of those children in South Florida who was almost hit over the head because I drank from the wrong water fountain. Coming from up north, I didn't know what this was all about. I'm the kind of bonus mother for some of the Rainbow Coalition at our synagogue, and some of them are dealing with it by using the family restrooms. And I think that that's the way some of the stores are dealing with it, by putting male, female, and family. And
you can see that at the mall. The mall completely redid their restrooms, and they have family restrooms. They have men and women restrooms. And yes, the family restrooms are a great benefit for people who might otherwise have issues.
I just returned from a trip during which I was sitting across tables from Germans and other Europeans and sometimes Chinese and Indians, and we were talking about the words that we differentiate for talking about public bathrooms or toilets. So in Britain, they're loos or WC for water closet, and toilets in Europe. Why do you call them restrooms in the States? They asked. You're not resting.
Well, we tend to not want to be really graphic, which is why we won't say toilets. I don't understand. I mean, it's just a tradition that we want to call it something that doesn't sound like you're going to the bathroom. And it is different than most other places. Toilets is usually the word used in a lot of places because that's what you really need. That's what you're there for. But we like euphemisms. So we're resting when we do these things.
Thanks. In many poor countries, one of the main obstacles to increasing the education rate, particularly of girls, is the fact that there's no separate bathrooms with water for them, particularly when they have their period. And so they drop out around the age of puberty.
Yeah.
Was this a factor in any way in development of the schools in the U.S.?
Well, for the very long time in the United States, girls didn't go to school. They were either educated at home or they weren't educated at all. So that took care of that problem until women started being able to be out in public more. And so, yes, it did have an impact in terms of, but it's part of it was just girls weren't supposed to be out in public at all. So then, but yes, certainly for ethnic and racial minorities, it had a huge impact because, you know, you had the separate school. I mean, Lincoln, here in Lincoln Middle School was the African-American high school here. And one of the things that they told me was, when I was talking about this, was that they only had 2 restrooms in the entire high school. And I don't know if you've seen high school restrooms recently, but they're really pretty, not lovely, I'll put it that way. But they only had 2 restrooms in the whole school, which meant that obviously it was difficult, and certainly difficult for the girls to use. So yes, I think it certainly had an impact.
Your talk or presentation has certainly brought light to this issue, that something that coming from the state of Wisconsin never was a problem. Everything was open for everything. We were always known as a squeaky clean state and really very progressive. And then came Scott Walker and things really changed. So about 15 years ago, there was a musical in New York called Urinetown, and I couldn't help but seeing the purpose now of that musical in light of your presentation, because that was the whole issue in this part of New York City, that there were no restrooms and they were fighting over building them and then having to pay for them, or do you just let urine flow all over?
Yeah.
And back in the late 90s, I went to Europe, and and it was 14 days on a coach mostly, and we went 5,000 miles. We used public restrooms off the interstates or big highways, and all of them were pay.
Oh, and I didn't actually mention that for a while in the United States, we did have paid restrooms, which was a royal pain because you had to have your dime or your nickel or whatever it was and have it and so forth. Those were phased out because they turned out to be more trouble than they were worth, because somebody had to come in and collect the money and do all these things, and then they get stuck and your money would get stuck, and so they were phased out.
Question about the EEOC and OSHA. Do you think part of the reason might also be that they're pretty vulnerable agencies? So if they stick themselves into a culture war, they may lose their money in their agency.
Yeah, I mean, they are certainly going to be under the chopping block, I think, probably with some of the cuts that may be proposed. And so yes, they are vulnerable. And I think even though they have the right to go in and make changes if they want to, this is not an issue that they're choosing to do that on.
Okay, one more question.
This isn't really a question, it's an experience. The historic Ahwahnee Lodge in Yosemite National Park has a men's room in the lobby. Very nice. Women's room, where is it? Well, the guide said it's upstairs. So, well, why is the women's room located upstairs and there's not even an elevator? I mean, this building was built in what, the 1910s, 1920s? Oh, she said, it's because at the time they felt that men should not be able to see women going in and out of restrooms. So there was this sort of hangover of this Victorian prudery, it seems.
We can be very Victorian. We can be very Victorian in this country. One of the things that happened with women is, for a while, they wouldn't use the restrooms because it felt like you were becoming half naked in public, and that wasn't a good thing. And so it took a while. The suffragettes and people like that would say, hey, you know, this is okay. We really can do this. But for a while, for some women, it was not only with the petticoats and the hats and all this other stuff, but it was also just seen as not being polite and ladylike to use restrooms. And the doors had to come all the way down to the floor and the stalls and things like that, so that people wouldn't notice that they were doing it.
Lynn, thank you very much. This was very entertaining and informative. And so please come and chat with Lynn if you've got further questions or comments.
It was okay with my cold. You have to remember, you have to remember